I worked the night shift at a 24-hour gas station on the outskirts of Denver, and what happened to me 3 months ago still makes me check every shadow twice before I go to sleep. My name is Marcus, I'm 26, and I thought I'd seen every type of weirdo that crawls out after midnight. I was wrong. It started on a Tuesday in late October. The temperature had dropped suddenly that week, and most people were staying indoors after dark. My shift runs from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and by 2 a.m., the place is usually dead, except for the occasional trucker or drunk college kid buying energy drinks. That's when I first noticed him. He was standing under the flickering streetlight across from the station, just outside the reach of our security cameras. Average height, wearing a dark hoodie pulled up over his head, hands shoved deep in his pockets. At first, I figured he was waiting for someone, or maybe just taking a smoke break. But after 20 minutes, he was still there, perfectly still, facing the store. I tried to get a better look at him through the window, but every time I moved closer to the glass, he seemed to step back just enough to stay in the shadows. The whole thing gave me an uneasy feeling, but I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Working alone at night can mess with your head sometimes. The next night, he was back. Same spot, same position, same eerie stillness. This time, I decided to do something about it. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, but the moment I crossed the threshold, he was gone. Not walking away, not running. Just gone. Like he'd never been there at all. I swept the flashlight beam across the empty parking lot and felt my skin crawl. By the fourth night, I was dreading my shift. Sure enough, at exactly 2:17 a.m., there he was again. I'd started timing it. He always appeared at the same time, always in the same spot. I called my manager Dave, but he just laughed it off and told me to call the cops if I was really worried. The problem was, the guy wasn't technically doing anything illegal. He was standing on a public sidewalk, not bothering anyone. That's when things escalated. On Friday night, I was restocking the coolers when I heard the door chime. I looked up expecting to see a customer, but the store was empty. The automatic doors were closed, and nobody was outside. I checked the security monitor. Nothing. But I could have sworn I heard that chime. I rewound the footage, but the cameras showed nothing unusual. Just me, alone in the store, looking increasingly paranoid. The weekend brought a brief reprieve. My coworker Jenny covered Saturday and Sunday nights, and she didn't report anything strange. I started to think maybe the guy had moved on, found someone else to creep out. I should have known better. Monday night, he was back, but this time he'd moved closer. Instead of standing across the street, he was in our parking lot, positioned between two cars where the shadows were deepest. I could barely make out his silhouette, but I knew he was watching me. Every time I looked in his direction, I felt this overwhelming sense of being studied, like a specimen under a microscope. I decided to test something. I moved from behind the counter to the coffee machine, then to the magazine rack, then back to the register. Each time I changed position, I could see him shifting slightly, adjusting his angle to keep me in view. He was definitely tracking my movements. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the reflection of the store window, I could see his face for the first time. He wasn't just watching me. He was smiling. Not a friendly smile, but something twisted and hungry that made my stomach turn. I grabbed my phone and called the police. While I was on the line with the dispatcher, I kept my eyes on him. The operator said they'd send a patrol car, but it would be at least 15 minutes. I watched the clock, counting down the seconds, but when I looked back outside, he was gone again. The cops showed up 20 minutes later, took my statement, and promised to increase patrols in the area. Officer Martinez seemed to take me seriously, which was a relief. She said they'd had reports of a suspicious person in the neighborhood and told me to call immediately if I saw him again. For the next week, the extra police presence seemed to work. No sign of my watcher, and I started to relax. Maybe he'd gotten spooked and moved on to easier prey. I was finally sleeping better during the day and not jumping at every shadow. Then came the phone calls. It started with hang-ups. The store phone would ring, I'd answer, and after a few seconds of silence, the line would go dead. At first, I thought it was just prank calls. We get those sometimes. But then I noticed the pattern. The calls always came at 2:17 a.m., the exact time my watcher used to appear. On the third night of calls, instead of hanging up, he spoke. "I know you're alone in there, Marcus." His voice was soft, almost whisper quiet, but there was something deeply unsettling about the way he said my name. I'd never told him my name. It wasn't on my uniform, and the only place it appeared was on my name tag, which was too small to read from outside. "Who is this?" I demanded, but the line went dead. I immediately called Officer Martinez, but she was off duty. The dispatcher said they'd send someone when a unit became available, but it was a busy night. I was on my own. The calls continued every night for a week. Sometimes he'd just breathe into the phone. Other times he'd say things that made my skin crawl. "You look tired tonight, Marcus. That's a nice shirt you're wearing. I like watching you work." The worst part was that he was describing things in real time. He could see me, but I couldn't see him. I started closing all the blinds, but somehow he still knew exactly what I was doing. It was like he had eyes everywhere. I begged Dave to let me switch to day shifts, but we were short-staffed, and he needed someone reliable on nights. He did install additional security cameras and gave me a panic button that would alert the police directly. It made me feel slightly better, but not much. 2 weeks into the phone calls, things got worse. I arrived at work to find a manila envelope taped to the employee entrance. Inside were photos, dozens of them. Pictures of me walking to my car after work, pumping gas, eating lunch in the break room. Some were taken through the store windows, others from impossible angles that suggested he'd been inside the building. The most disturbing photo was taken in my apartment. I was asleep in my bed, completely unaware that someone was in my bedroom, close enough to photograph me. The timestamp showed it was taken just 6 hours earlier. I called the police immediately, and this time they took it seriously. Detective Sarah Chen was assigned to my case, and she had the photos analyzed for fingerprints and other evidence. She also arranged for increased security at the store, and suggested I stay with friends or family until they caught the guy. I moved in with my brother Jake, temporarily, but even there, I didn't feel safe. Every creak of the house, every shadow outside the window, every unexpected noise made me jump. I was barely sleeping, constantly looking over my shoulder, and my work performance was suffering. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later. Detective Chen called to tell me they'd identified my stalker through DNA evidence found on the envelope. His name was Robert Kellerman, a 34-year-old with a history of stalking and harassment charges. He'd been released from prison just 2 months before he started watching me. They arrested him at his apartment, where they found hundreds more photos of me, detailed notes about my schedule and habits, and plans for what he called the next phase. Detective Chen wouldn't tell me exactly what that meant, but her expression said enough. During questioning, Kellerman admitted to everything. He'd been watching me for months before I noticed him, learning my routines, finding ways into the store after hours to plant cameras and recording devices. He'd even broken into my apartment multiple times, not just to take photos, but to go through my belongings and learn everything he could about me. The most chilling revelation was his motivation. He claimed he'd chosen me because I reminded him of his younger brother, who had died in a car accident years earlier. In his twisted mind, he thought he could somehow replace his brother by becoming obsessed with me. He'd been planning to kidnap me and keep me in a basement room he'd prepared specifically for that purpose. Kellerman was sentenced to 8 years in prison for stalking, breaking and entering, and attempted kidnapping. Detective Chen assured me that he'd served the full sentence and would be monitored closely after his release. It's been 3 months since his arrest, and I'm slowly getting my life back to normal. I switched to day shifts and moved to a new apartment with better security. I still work at the gas station, but I'm looking for something else. Too many bad memories in that place. The hardest part is the paranoia that lingers. I still check my locks multiple times before bed, still scan crowds for familiar faces, still feel my heart race when my phone rings unexpectedly. My therapist says it's normal and that the anxiety will fade with time, but some nights I wonder if I'll ever feel completely safe again. The experience taught me that monsters are real, and they don't always look like what you'd expect. Robert Kellerman seemed like an ordinary guy, the kind of person you'd pass on the street without a second thought. But behind that normal facade was someone capable of turning another person's life into a waking nightmare. I still work nights sometimes, but never alone, and never without checking every shadow twice. Because once you've been hunted, you never forget what it feels like to be prey. My name is Elena, and I'm a 22-year-old art student at Portland State University. What I'm about to tell you happened during my junior year, and it's the reason I can't look at my own artwork the same way anymore. It started innocently enough, with a compliment that should have been flattering, but instead became the beginning of my worst nightmare. I was working late in the university art studio, putting finishing touches on a charcoal portrait for my advanced drawing class. The building was mostly empty, except for a few other dedicated students scattered across different floors. I loved these quiet evening hours when I could focus completely on my work without distractions. That's when I first met David Chen. He appeared beside my easel so quietly that I didn't notice him until he spoke. "That's incredible work," he said, his voice soft but intense. "The way you've captured the emotion in the eyes. It's like you can see into people's souls." I looked up to see a guy about my age, maybe a little older, with dark hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He was carrying a sketchbook and had paint stains on his fingers, so I assumed he was another art student. His compliment made me blush. I'd been struggling with that particular piece for weeks. "Thanks," I replied, setting down my charcoal. "I'm Elena. I don't think I've seen you around before." "David," he said, extending his hand. "I'm actually a graduate student. I focus on mixed media installations, but I really admire traditional drawing. Mind if I look at some of your other work?" I was flattered by his interest and showed him several pieces from my portfolio. He studied each one with an intensity that was both flattering and slightly uncomfortable. He asked detailed questions about my techniques, my inspiration, even my personal life. Where was I from? Did I live alone? What were my favorite places to work? At the time, I thought he was just being friendly and showing genuine interest in my art. Looking back, I realized he was gathering information. We talked for about an hour before I decided to pack up for the night. David offered to walk me to my car, which I appreciated since the campus parking lot could be sketchy after dark. He was charming and intelligent, and I found myself hoping I'd run into him again. I didn't have to wait long. The next evening, he was there again when I arrived at the studio, and the night after that. He always had a reason. He was working on a project, he wanted to see my progress, he had art books he thought I'd enjoy. I started looking forward to our conversations. After about a week of these encounters, David asked me out for coffee. I said yes, thinking it would be nice to talk somewhere other than the studio. We met at a small cafe near campus, and the conversation flowed easily. He was knowledgeable about art history, had traveled to museums across Europe, and seemed genuinely interested in my goals as an artist. But there were small things that bothered me. He knew details about my schedule that I didn't remember telling him. He mentioned seeing me at the library on Tuesday, but I couldn't recall mentioning that I'd been there. When I brought up a professor I was having trouble with, he knew exactly who I meant before I'd given any details. I brushed off these concerns, telling myself I was being paranoid. David was just observant and had a good memory. Besides, I was enjoying the attention from someone who appreciated my work so deeply. The red flags became harder to ignore when he started showing up everywhere I went. If I was grabbing lunch at the student union, David would appear with his own tray, acting surprised to see me. If I was studying in the library, he'd find my table and ask if he could join me. When I went to the campus coffee shop between classes, he'd be there waiting in line. "What a coincidence," he'd always say, with that same intense smile. After 2 weeks of these coincidences, I started feeling suffocated. David was nice enough, but I needed space. I began varying my routine, taking different routes across campus, studying in different locations. It didn't matter. He always found me. The breaking point came when I discovered he'd been in my dorm room. I lived in a single room on the 3rd floor of Morrison Hall. I was always careful about locking my door, especially since there had been some thefts in the building recently. But when I returned from class, one Thursday afternoon, I immediately knew something was wrong. My art supplies were arranged differently on my desk. My sketchbooks were stacked in a way I never left them. Most disturbing of all, several drawings were missing from my portfolio, including some figure studies I'd done for a life drawing class that I definitely wouldn't have shown to anyone. I reported the break-in to campus security, but they found no signs of forced entry. They suggested I might have forgotten to lock my door, or that I was mistaken about the missing items. I knew I wasn't mistaken, but I couldn't prove anything. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about David's intense interest in my work, his uncanny ability to find me anywhere on campus, his detailed knowledge of my schedule. I started putting pieces together that I didn't want to fit. The next day, I confronted him at the art studio. "David, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Have you been following me around campus?" His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "Following you? Elena, we just happen to have similar schedules. We're both art students. Of course, we end up in the same places. What about my dorm room? Someone was in there yesterday. Things were moved around, and some of my drawings are missing." Now his smile faltered slightly. "That's terrible. Have you reported it? Campus security should take that seriously." He seemed genuinely concerned, but I noticed he didn't actually deny being involved. I decided to be direct. "I think we should take a break from hanging out. I need some space to focus on my studies." The change in David's demeanor was immediate and frightening. His face went completely blank, and when he spoke, his voice was cold and flat. "You can't just dismiss me, Elena. We have a connection. I understand your art in a way no one else does. I've been documenting your creative process, studying your techniques. You're my muse." "Documenting my creative process? What does that mean?" He pulled out his phone and showed me the screen. It was filled with photos, hundreds of them. Pictures of me working in the studio, walking across campus, sitting in the library, eating in the cafeteria. Some were taken from close range, others from a distance with what must have been a telephoto lens. I felt sick. "David, this is stalking. You need to delete these photos and leave me alone." "You don't understand," he said, his voice becoming more agitated. "I'm preserving your artistic journey. These photos, your drawings, your daily routines, they're all part of a larger project. You're helping me create something beautiful." I backed away from him, grabbing my things. "Stay away from me, David. I'm serious." I left the studio and went straight to campus security. This time, I had evidence. The security officer, a middle-aged woman named Janet, took my complaint seriously and said they'd investigate immediately. But David wasn't done with me. Over the next few days, the harassment escalated. I'd find notes slipped under my dorm room door, written in David's careful handwriting. "You can't run from inspiration, Elena. Your art needs me to witness it. We're connected by something deeper than you understand." He started leaving gifts, art supplies I'd never asked for, books about famous artist-muse relationships, and most disturbingly, sketches he'd made of me based on his surveillance photos. The drawings were technically skilled but deeply unsettling, showing me in private moments when I thought I was alone. I stopped going to the art studio altogether and tried to work in my dorm room, but even there I didn't feel safe. I'd catch glimpses of someone watching from across the courtyard, and I was sure it was David. My roommate had moved out earlier in the semester, so I was completely alone. The worst incident happened on a Friday night. I was trying to sleep when I heard my door handle turning. I'd locked it, but someone was definitely trying to get in. I grabbed my phone and called campus security while hiding in my closet. "Elena?" David's voice came through the door. "I know you're in there. I brought you something special." I could hear him sliding something under the door, then his footsteps retreating down the hallway. When security arrived 10 minutes later, they found an envelope containing photos of me sleeping. The timestamp showed they'd been taken just 2 nights earlier. That's when I learned the full extent of David's obsession. Campus security searched his graduate student apartment and found what they described as a shrine dedicated to me. The walls were covered with hundreds of photos tracking my daily activities over the past month. He had detailed schedules of my classes, maps of my walking routes, and copies of my artwork that he'd somehow obtained. Most disturbing was a journal where he'd written elaborate fantasies about our relationship. In his mind, we were collaborating on a grand artistic project together. He believed I was communicating with him through my artwork, sending him hidden messages that only he could interpret. The police arrested David on charges of stalking, breaking and entering, and harassment. During questioning, he admitted to following me for weeks before we'd ever spoken, learning my routines and interests so he could approach me in a way that seemed natural. He'd been using his graduate student access to get into buildings after hours, which explained how he'd gotten into my dorm room. He'd also been bribing other students to get copies of my assignments, and had even convinced a work-study student in the art department to let him photograph my portfolio. The most chilling revelation was that I wasn't his first victim. David had been expelled from his previous university for similar behavior toward another female art student. He'd moved to Portland specifically to start over, but his obsession patterns had quickly resumed. David was sentenced to 2 years in prison and issued a permanent restraining order. The university also expelled him and banned him from campus. I thought my nightmare was over, but the psychological damage was just beginning. I couldn't focus on my artwork anymore. Every time I picked up a pencil or brush, I thought about David watching me, studying my techniques, believing he was part of my creative process. The art studio felt contaminated, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching me work. I switched my major to psychology and transferred to a different university the following semester. It took months of therapy to work through the trauma of being stalked, and even now, 3 years later, I'm still cautious about who I let into my life. The experience taught me that artistic passion can be twisted into something dark and possessive. David genuinely believed he was appreciating my art, but what he was really doing was stealing pieces of my life and autonomy. He turned something I loved, creating art, into a source of fear and anxiety. I've started drawing again recently, but I'm careful about where and when I work. I never stay late in the studios alone, and I'm selective about who I show my work to. Trust, once broken by someone who claimed to understand your soul, is incredibly difficult to rebuild. The scariest part wasn't the break-ins or the photos, or even the threats. It was realizing that someone had been watching me for weeks before I ever knew he existed, studying me like a subject, planning his approach, and constructing an elaborate fantasy around my life without my knowledge or consent. David is out of prison now, and sometimes I wonder if he's found another muse to obsess over. I hope not, but I know that people like him don't usually change. They just find new targets and new ways to justify their behavior. I still create art, but I'll never again take for granted the simple freedom of working alone without looking over my shoulder. My name is Jessica, and I'm a 24-year-old delivery driver for a meal kit service called Fresh Plate in suburban Phoenix. I've been doing this job for about 8 months, and I genuinely love it. The flexibility, the decent pay, and the fact that I get to drive around listening to podcasts all day. What I didn't love was discovering that one of my regular customers had been using my deliveries as an excuse to learn everything about my life. It started with customer 847B, whose real name I later learned was Michael Torres. His address was 2847 Saguaro Lane, a modest single-story house in a quiet neighborhood called Desert Springs. I delivered to him every Tuesday and Friday, always the same order: 2 servings of the Mediterranean chicken bowl with extra vegetables. Michael seemed like a perfectly normal customer at first. He was always home when I arrived, which was unusual since most people have their deliveries left at the door. He'd answer immediately when I knocked, like he'd been waiting by the window. He was polite, always said thank you, and occasionally made small talk about the weather or asked how my day was going. The first red flag should have been how much he knew about the delivery process. Most customers don't realize that drivers can see their order history, delivery preferences, and previous driver notes. But Michael would make comments that suggested he understood exactly how our system worked. "I bet you have a lot of deliveries today," he'd say on busy Fridays. "The app probably has you running all over the valley." Or, "I always request the earliest delivery window because I know you drivers prefer to get the day started early." I thought he was just being considerate, maybe a former delivery driver himself. I had no idea he was pumping me for information about my routes and schedule. The conversations gradually became more personal. He'd ask about my other jobs. I also worked part-time at a bookstore, and whether I was a student. I mentioned that I was saving money to go back to school for my teaching degree, and he seemed very interested in that. He asked which schools I was considering, what grade level I wanted to teach, whether I had family in the area. At the time, I thought he was just being friendly. Some customers like to chat, and it made the job more pleasant than just dropping packages and leaving. Michael was always respectful, never made inappropriate comments, and our conversations never lasted more than a few minutes. But then, I started noticing him in other places. The first time was at the Barnes & Noble where I worked evenings. I was shelving books in the education section when I saw him browsing nearby. He looked up, seemed surprised to see me, and came over to say hello. "Jessica! What a coincidence. I had no idea you worked here." He explained that he was looking for books about teaching methods because he was thinking about changing careers. We talked for a few minutes about different education programs, and he bought a book about classroom management. It seemed like a perfectly innocent encounter. The second time was at a Starbucks near Arizona State University, where I was meeting with an admissions counselor about their teaching program. I was sitting at a corner table, reviewing application materials, when I noticed Michael in line for coffee. Again, he acted surprised to see me, and asked if he could join me for a few minutes. "Are you applying to ASU?" he asked, glancing at the papers spread across my table. "That's exciting. What program?" I told him about the elementary education degree I was pursuing, and he asked detailed questions about the requirements, the timeline, even the cost. He said he was considering going back to school too, and was researching different options. Looking back, I realized he was gathering intelligence, but at the time it felt like a normal conversation with someone who shared similar interests. The third encounter was what made me start to feel uneasy. I was at a grocery store near my apartment doing my weekly shopping when I ran into Michael in the produce section. This time, his surprise seemed less genuine. "We really need to stop meeting like this," he said, with a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "People will think we're following each other around." The comment bothered me because it was exactly what I was starting to wonder. Phoenix is a big city, and the chances of randomly running into the same person 3 times in different locations seemed unlikely. I started paying more attention during our delivery interactions. Michael always had questions ready, and they were getting more specific. He asked about my apartment complex. Did I like living there? Was it safe? Did I have good neighbors? He wanted to know about my car. Was it reliable for all the driving I did? Had I had any trouble with it lately? When I mentioned that I was looking for a new apartment closer to ASU, he immediately offered suggestions. He knew the names of specific complexes, their rental rates, and which neighborhoods were safest for young women living alone. His knowledge was too detailed for someone who was just being helpful. The breaking point came during a Friday delivery in late November. I knocked on Michael's door as usual, but instead of answering immediately, he called out for me to come in. He said he was in the kitchen and couldn't come to the door right away. I should have left the food outside and walked away, but I'd been delivering to him for months and he'd always been perfectly appropriate. I opened the door and stepped into the entryway. "I'm just setting the food on the table," I called out. "Actually, could you bring it to the kitchen? I'm in the middle of cooking something and can't step away." I walked toward the back of the house, following his voice. The kitchen was at the end of a short hallway, and as I approached, I could see Michael standing at the stove with his back to me. But what made my blood run cold was what I saw on the walls. The entire kitchen was covered with photos of me. Pictures of me making deliveries to other houses, walking to my car, going into the bookstore, sitting in coffee shops. Some were clearly taken with a telephoto lens from a distance. Others were close enough that he must have been just a few feet away, without me noticing. There was a map of Phoenix with colored pins marking all my regular delivery addresses, a schedule showing my work hours at both jobs, printouts of my social media profiles, even though I was sure I'd never told him my last name. Most disturbing was a notebook lying open on the counter, filled with detailed observations about my daily routines. What time I usually started deliveries, which routes I took between stops, where I ate lunch when I went to the gym. He'd been following me for weeks, maybe months, documenting my entire life. I backed out of the kitchen as quietly as possible, but Michael must have heard me. "Jessica, did you find the kitchen okay?" I didn't answer. I just ran. I dropped the food bag in the hallway and sprinted to my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I drove straight to the police station and filed a report. The officer who took my statement was Detective Maria Santos, and she immediately understood the seriousness of the situation. She said they'd investigate right away and advised me to stay away from Michael's address. When police searched Michael's house the next day, they found even more evidence of his obsession. He had detailed files on not just me, but several other female delivery drivers. He'd been using the delivery service as a way to identify targets, then systematically stalking them to learn their routines. His computer contained hundreds of photos of different women, organized by name and delivery route. He had spreadsheets, tracking their schedules, maps of their regular locations, and notes about their personal lives gathered from forced conversations during deliveries. Most chilling was a folder labeled Future Plans that contained detailed scenarios for escalating contact with his targets. He'd been planning to accidentally run into me at ASU when I started classes, maybe even enroll in some of the same courses. Detective Santos told me that Michael had been arrested twice before for stalking, but the charges had been dropped when his victims moved away and declined to testify. He'd specifically chosen to work with delivery services because it gave him legitimate access to women's homes and schedules. Michael was arrested and charged with stalking, harassment, and invasion of privacy. During questioning, he admitted to following multiple delivery drivers, but claimed he was just getting to know his regular drivers better. He genuinely seemed to believe that his behavior was normal customer interaction. The delivery service immediately fired him as a customer and implemented new safety protocols for drivers. They also provided me with a security system for my apartment and paid for counseling to help me deal with the trauma. Michael pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 18 months in prison plus 3 years of probation. He's also banned from using any delivery services and required to stay away from all his previous targets. The experience completely changed how I approach my job. I no longer engage in personal conversations with customers, even ones who seem friendly and harmless. I vary my routes and delivery times when possible, and I never enter a customer's home for any reason. I also had to change my entire routine. I moved to a different apartment, switched gyms, and even started shopping at different stores. The idea that someone had been watching and documenting my daily life for months made me feel violated in a way that's hard to describe. The hardest part was realizing how easily I'd been manipulated. Michael had used my natural friendliness and desire to provide good customer service against me. Every innocent question he'd asked was actually part of a systematic effort to gather information about my life. I still work as a delivery driver, but I'm much more cautious now. I trust my instincts when something feels off, and I don't worry about seeming rude if a customer makes me uncomfortable. My safety is more important than customer satisfaction ratings. The case also revealed a larger problem with delivery services and customer safety. Companies need better screening processes and clearer protocols for drivers who feel threatened. Too many women in service jobs are expected to be friendly and accommodating even when customers cross boundaries. Michael is scheduled for release in 6 months, and I'll be moving to a different state before that happens. Detective Santos assured me that he'll be monitored closely, but I don't want to take any chances. The thought of him being free and potentially looking for me again is terrifying. I've learned that predators often hide behind normal, everyday interactions. Michael seemed like just another friendly customer, but he was actually using our professional relationship to stalk me systematically. He turned my job, something I enjoyed and was good at, into a tool for his obsession. The experience taught me that being polite and professional doesn't mean I have to answer personal questions or tolerate behavior that makes me uncomfortable. I wish I'd trusted my instincts earlier when the coincidental meetings started happening. Now I tell other delivery drivers to be careful about customers who seem too interested in their personal lives or who always happen to be home when they arrive. Those red flags that seem minor at first can be signs of something much more dangerous. My name is Amanda, and I'm a 28-year-old personal trainer at a high-end gym called Elite Fitness in downtown Seattle. I've been working there for 3 years, and I love helping people reach their fitness goals. What I didn't expect was that one of my clients would become so obsessed with tracking my progress that he'd turn my own life into his personal fitness experiment. It started with Trevor Hoffman, a 35-year-old software engineer who signed up for personal training sessions in early March. He was soft-spoken, polite, and seemed genuinely motivated to get in shape. He'd recently gone through a divorce and said he wanted to rebuild his confidence and health. I respected that. A lot of my clients come to fitness during major life transitions. Trevor was the ideal client in many ways. He showed up on time for every session, followed my workout plans religiously, and asked thoughtful questions about nutrition and exercise science. He was making excellent progress, losing weight and gaining strength at a steady pace. I was proud of the work we were doing together, but Trevor's interest in fitness went beyond normal client enthusiasm. He started asking detailed questions about my own training routine, what time I worked out, which exercises I preferred, how I structured my weekly schedule. At first, I thought he was just looking for additional motivation or trying to learn from my experience. "I bet you work out every day," he'd say during our sessions. "What's your favorite time to train? Early morning or evening?" I explained that I usually worked out after my last client session around 7 p.m. when the gym was quieter. I mentioned that I preferred strength training on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, with cardio and flexibility work on the other days. Trevor seemed fascinated by these details. He'd ask follow-up questions about my specific exercises, how long my workouts lasted, whether I trained alone or with other trainers. I thought he was just being thorough about understanding fitness principles. Then he started showing up at the gym outside of our scheduled sessions. The first time, I was finishing my own workout around 8 p.m. when I noticed Trevor on a treadmill across the gym. He waved and came over to chat, explaining that he'd decided to add some extra cardio sessions to his routine. He asked about the exercises I just finished and wanted to know if I thought he was ready to try some of the more advanced movements. It seemed reasonable enough. Dedicated clients sometimes come in for additional workouts, and I was happy to see his commitment. But then, it started happening regularly. Every time I worked out, Trevor would appear within 15 or 20 minutes, always with a plausible excuse for being there. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd squeeze in a quick session. I couldn't sleep, so I figured I'd come burn off some energy. I wanted to practice those deadlifts you showed me while the technique was still fresh. After a few weeks of these coincidences, I started varying my workout times to see what would happen. If I came in at 6 a.m. instead of 7 p.m., Trevor would show up around 6:20. If I switched to lunch hour workouts, he'd appear during his lunch break from work. I mentioned this to my colleague Sarah, another trainer at the gym. She said she'd noticed Trevor hanging around even when he didn't have sessions scheduled, and that he'd been asking other staff members questions about my schedule and training habits. He wanted to know which days you work late, whether you ever train clients at other locations, stuff like that, Sarah told me. I thought it was weird, but I figured maybe he was just trying to book additional sessions with you. That's when I started paying closer attention to Trevor's behavior during our regular sessions. He was asking increasingly personal questions about my life outside the gym. Did I live nearby? Did I have a home gym set up? What did I do for cardio when the weather was bad? When I mentioned that I sometimes went for runs in Discovery Park on weekends, Trevor immediately wanted to know my favorite routes and what time I usually went. He said he was thinking about taking up running and wanted recommendations for good trails. I should have been more cautious about sharing personal information, but Trevor had been such a model client that I didn't see the harm. He seemed genuinely interested in fitness, and I thought I was helping him develop a more well-rounded exercise routine. The situation escalated when I started noticing Trevor outside the gym. I was leaving a coffee shop near my apartment one Saturday morning when I saw him sitting at an outdoor table with a laptop. He looked up as I passed, acted surprised to see me, and invited me to join him for coffee. He said he was working on a project and liked to get out of his apartment on weekends. The coffee shop was only 3 blocks from my building, in a neighborhood that was nowhere near where Trevor lived or worked. When I asked what brought him to that area, he said he was exploring different parts of the city and had heard good things about the coffee there. A week later, I was at a grocery store in Capitol Hill when I ran into Trevor in the produce section. Again, he seemed surprised to see me and explained that he was visiting a friend who lived nearby. He asked about the vegetables I was buying and wanted to know if I had any healthy recipe recommendations. The third encounter was at Discovery Park on the running trail I'd mentioned during one of our sessions. I was about 2 miles into my usual Saturday morning run when I saw Trevor stretching near the trailhead. He was wearing brand new running gear and said he'd decided to try out the route I'd recommended. "I hope you don't mind if I run with you for a bit," he said. "I'm still learning proper pacing, and it would be great to get some tips from a pro." I couldn't think of a polite way to refuse, so we ran together for about 20 minutes. Trevor asked constant questions about my running technique, my breathing patterns, how often I ran this particular route. He seemed to be studying my every movement. After that run, I started feeling genuinely uncomfortable. The repeated coincidental meetings were too frequent to be random, especially since they were happening in locations I'd specifically mentioned to Trevor during our training sessions. I decided to test my suspicions. During our next session, I casually mentioned that I was thinking about trying a new yoga studio in Fremont and might check out their Sunday morning class. I made up the name of a studio and gave a fake address. Sure enough, that Sunday morning I received a text from Trevor asking if I'd tried the yoga class yet and saying he was interested in checking it out too. When I told him I'd decided not to go, he seemed disappointed and asked if I had any other studio recommendations. That's when I knew for certain that Trevor was deliberately following me and using information from our conversations to track my activities. I felt sick, realizing that our professional relationship had been a cover for him to gather intelligence about my personal life. I immediately spoke with my manager, Derek, about the situation. Elite Fitness has strict policies about client-trainer boundaries, and Derek took my concerns seriously. He reviewed the gym's security footage and confirmed that Trevor had been coming in frequently outside his scheduled sessions, always timing his visits to coincide with my workouts. Derek also discovered that Trevor had been asking other staff members for my personal information. He tried to get my home address from the front desk, claiming he wanted to send me a thank you card. He'd asked maintenance staff about my car and which parking spaces I typically used. Most disturbing was what Derek found when he checked Trevor's membership activity. Trevor had been using his gym access card to enter the building at all hours, including late at night and early in the morning when the gym was closed. To regular members, he had a premium membership that included 24-hour access, but there was no legitimate reason for him to be there at 2 a.m. or 5 a.m. Derek immediately revoked Trevor's membership and banned him from the premises. He also filed a report with building security and advised me to document any further contact attempts. Trevor didn't take the termination well. He started calling the gym repeatedly, demanding to speak with me, and insisting that there had been a misunderstanding. He claimed he was just a dedicated client who was passionate about fitness, and that I was overreacting to innocent coincidences. When the gym refused to reinstate his membership, Trevor began showing up at locations where he'd previously run into me. He'd wait outside the coffee shop near my apartment, hoping to catch me coming or going. He'd park near Discovery Park on weekend mornings, watching for me to arrive for my runs. The most frightening incident happened on a Thursday evening. I was leaving the gym after my last client session when I noticed Trevor's car in the parking lot. He'd been banned from the building, but there was nothing stopping him from waiting outside. I called Derek, who came out to escort me to my car. Trevor rolled down his window as we passed and called out to me. "Amanda, please, I just want to talk. I think there's been a huge misunderstanding. I'm not stalking you. I'm just trying to learn from the best trainer I've ever had." Derek told him to leave immediately, or we'd call the police. Trevor drove away, but not before shouting that he'd invested too much in his fitness journey to give up now. That phrase, invested too much, made my skin crawl. It suggested that Trevor saw our trainer-client relationship as something more than professional, that he believed he had some kind of claim on my time and attention. I filed a police report the next day. Officer Jennifer Walsh took my statement and explained that while Trevor's behavior was clearly stalking, it would be difficult to prosecute unless he made direct threats or violated a restraining order. She advised me to document every encounter, vary my routines as much as possible, and consider getting a restraining order if the behavior continued. She also suggested that I inform my apartment building security about the situation. The harassment continued for another month. Trevor would drive slowly past the gym during my work hours, park outside businesses where he'd previously encountered me, and even started following me on social media using fake accounts. He created multiple Instagram profiles with fitness-related usernames and would comment on my posts with detailed observations about my workouts and nutrition. The comments weren't threatening, but they demonstrated that he was still monitoring my activities closely. The breaking point came when I discovered that Trevor had been tracking my location using technology. I found a small GPS device attached to my car's undercarriage, hidden near the rear wheel well. It was the kind of tracker that parents use to monitor teenage drivers, but Trevor had been using it to follow my movements around the city. With this evidence, I was able to get a restraining order against Trevor. The police arrested him for stalking and invasion of privacy. During the investigation, they discovered that he'd installed tracking apps on his phone that could monitor my social media activity, and had been using public records searches to gather information about my personal life. Trevor's obsession went far beyond normal client enthusiasm. He'd been treating me like a fitness experiment, documenting my routines and habits as if I were a subject in his personal research project. He genuinely believed that by studying my lifestyle closely enough, he could achieve the same level of fitness and success. During questioning, Trevor admitted to following me, but insisted that he was just trying to learn proper fitness techniques. He claimed that watching me train and live was educational, like having a 24/7 masterclass in health and wellness. Trevor was sentenced to 6 months in jail and 2 years of probation. He's also required to stay away from Elite Fitness and any gym where I work. The restraining order prohibits him from coming within 500 feet of me or my residence. The experience completely changed how I approach client relationships. I no longer share personal information about my own training routines or lifestyle habits. I keep conversations focused strictly on the client's goals and progress, and I trust my instincts when someone seems too interested in my personal life. Elite Fitness also implemented new safety protocols for trainers. We now have panic buttons that connect directly to security, and there are stricter policies about client access to trainer information. The gym also provides self-defense training for all staff members. The hardest part was realizing how Trevor had manipulated our professional relationship. He'd been the perfect client, motivated, respectful, making great progress. But it was all a performance, designed to gain my trust and access to my life. He turned my passion for helping people into a tool for his obsession. I still love being a personal trainer, but I'm much more cautious about boundaries now. I've learned that some people will exploit any relationship, even a professional one, if it gives them access to someone they're fixated on. Trevor is scheduled for release in 2 months, and I'm already making plans to relocate to a different city. The thought of him being free and potentially resuming his surveillance is terrifying. I know he still believes that studying my lifestyle is the key to his own fitness success. The experience taught me that predators can hide behind any legitimate interaction. Trevor used his role as a client to justify his invasive behavior, claiming it was all about fitness education. But what he was really doing was using my professional expertise as an excuse to stalk and monitor my entire life. I now tell other trainers to be wary of clients who ask too many personal questions or who seem more interested in the trainer's lifestyle than their own fitness goals. Those red flags that seem like enthusiasm can actually be signs of something much more dangerous. My name is Chloe, and I'm a 25-year-old rideshare driver in Austin, Texas. I've been driving for Uber Lyft for about 1.5 years, mostly working weekend nights when the money is best. The job has its challenges. Drunk passengers, difficult navigation, long hours, but I generally enjoy meeting different people and having the flexibility to set my own schedule. What I didn't expect was that one regular passenger would turn my car into his personal surveillance vehicle. It started with a passenger I'll call Kevin Walsh. He was a frequent rider who always requested trips from the same apartment complex in South Austin to various locations around the city. Kevin was in his early 30s, worked in tech, and seemed like a perfectly normal customer. He was always polite, tipped well through the app, and made pleasant conversation during rides. Kevin's trips followed a predictable pattern. He'd request rides on Friday and Saturday nights, usually between 8 p.m. and midnight, going to restaurants, bars, or entertainment venues downtown. He was always ready when I arrived, never kept me waiting, and his destinations were always legitimate businesses that I could verify were real. What made Kevin stand out as a passenger was how much attention he paid to my driving. Most riders are on their phones, looking out the window, or making conversation, but Kevin would watch everything I did. He'd comment on my route choices, ask about my GPS settings, and seemed genuinely interested in the mechanics of rideshare driving. "You're really good at navigating traffic," he'd say. "Do you always take this route downtown, or do you switch it up depending on the time?" I thought he was just making conversation, maybe considering becoming a driver himself. He asked thoughtful questions about the job. How many hours I worked, which neighborhoods were most profitable, whether I felt safe driving alone at night. After about a month of regular rides, Kevin started requesting longer trips. Instead of just going downtown, he'd ask me to drive him to suburbs, like Cedar Park or Round Rock, sometimes for rides that took 45 minutes each way. The destinations were always legitimate: restaurants, shopping centers, movie theaters, but the trip seemed unnecessary for someone who lived in Central Austin. During these longer rides, Kevin would ask more personal questions about my life. Did I enjoy living in Austin? How long had I been driving? Did I have other jobs, or was this my main income? He seemed particularly interested in my schedule and whether I drove during the day or just at night. I didn't think much of it at first. Passengers often get chatty during longer rides, and Kevin was always respectful. He never made inappropriate comments or crossed any obvious boundaries. If anything, he seemed like one of my more considerate regular customers. But then I started noticing Kevin in places where he shouldn't have been. The first incident was at a Target in North Austin, where I was doing my weekly grocery shopping on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the pharmacy section picking up a prescription when I saw Kevin browsing in the electronics department. He noticed me and came over to say hello, acting surprised to see me. Chloe! What a coincidence, I was just picking up some headphones for work. He asked what I was doing in that part of town, and I mentioned that I lived nearby. Kevin said he was visiting a friend in the area and had decided to run some errands while he was there. The conversation was brief and seemed innocent enough. The second encounter was at a coffee shop near the University of Texas campus. I was meeting a friend for lunch when I spotted Kevin at a corner table with a laptop. Again, he acted surprised to see me and explained that he sometimes worked from different locations to get out of his apartment. I love this place, he said. Great coffee and usually pretty quiet during the day. Do you come here often? I told him I was just meeting a friend and didn't usually frequent that area. Kevin mentioned that he'd been exploring different neighborhoods in Austin and asked if I had any recommendations for good coffee shops or restaurants. The third time was what made me start to feel uneasy. I was at a gas station near my apartment complex, filling up my car around 11 p.m. after finishing my driving shift. Kevin pulled up to the pump next to mine and got out of his car. Hey Chloe, funny running into you here. Just finished driving for the night? This encounter felt different because it was late at night, in my own neighborhood, and Kevin seemed less surprised to see me than he had during the previous meetings. When I asked what he was doing in that area, he said he'd been visiting friends nearby and was heading home. But Kevin's apartment was in South Austin, and this gas station was in North Austin, nowhere near his usual pickup location. There was no logical reason for him to be there, unless he'd followed me. I started paying more attention during our rideshare trips. Kevin always sat in the front passenger seat, which wasn't unusual, but I noticed he was watching my GPS screen intently and asking specific questions about my routes home after dropping him off. Do you usually head straight home after your last ride? Or do you sometimes stop for food or gas? He'd ask. I always wonder how drivers manage the logistics of working such late hours. He also started making comments that suggested he knew more about my schedule than I'd told him. He'd mentioned seeing my car in certain areas of the city, or ask if I'd been busy driving on specific days when we hadn't had any scheduled rides. The breaking point came during a ride in late September. Kevin had requested a trip from his usual pickup location to a restaurant in East Austin. During the drive, he started asking about my personal safety as a female driver working alone at night. Do you ever worry about driving in certain neighborhoods? He asked. I've noticed you seem really comfortable navigating all parts of the city, even the areas that might be sketchy after dark. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. I saw your car parked outside that apartment complex on Riverside Drive last week. Do you live around there, or were you just dropping someone off? I had never told Kevin where I lived, and I'd never picked up or dropped off any passengers at my apartment complex. The only way he could have seen my car there was if he'd been following me home after rides. I finished the trip in silence and immediately contacted Uber's safety team when I got home. I reported Kevin's behavior and requested that he be blocked from requesting rides from me. The safety representative took my concerns seriously and said they'd investigate the situation. But Kevin's harassment didn't stop when he could no longer book rides with me directly. A few days after I reported him, I started receiving ride requests from passengers with different names, but pickup locations near Kevin's apartment. When I'd arrive, Kevin would be waiting instead of the person who'd booked the ride. Sorry for the confusion, he'd say. My friend couldn't make it, so I'm taking the ride instead. Hope that's okay. Technically, this violated Uber's terms of service, but it was difficult to prove that Kevin was deliberately circumventing the system. He'd always have a plausible explanation for why he was taking someone else's ride. During these rides, Kevin became more direct about his interest in my personal life. He'd ask about my apartment, whether I lived alone, what I did during my time off from driving. He also started making comments about having seen me around the city during times when I wasn't working. "I think I saw you at that Whole Foods on Lamar yesterday," he'd say. "Were you doing your grocery shopping?" I was thinking about saying hi, but you looked busy. The most disturbing incident happened on a Friday night in early October. I was driving home after my shift when I noticed a car following me. It stayed several car lengths behind, but made every turn I made, even when I took an indirect route to test whether I was being followed. When I pulled into my apartment complex, the car drove past without stopping, but I got a clear look at the driver. It was Kevin. I immediately called the police and filed a report. Officer David Martinez took my statement and explained that while Kevin's behavior was concerning, it would be difficult to prove stalking unless he made direct threats or violated a restraining order. He advised me to document every encounter, avoid driving alone when possible, and consider getting a restraining order if the harassment continued. He also suggested that I report the incidents to Ubers and consider temporarily stopping rideshare driving. I took Officer Martinez's advice and stopped driving for Uber while I figured out what to do next. But Kevin found other ways to contact me. He started leaving reviews for rides we'd taken weeks earlier, writing detailed comments about my driving skills, and mentioning specific conversations we'd had. The reviews weren't threatening, but they demonstrated that he was still thinking about our interactions and had detailed memories of our time together. Kevin also began showing up at locations where he'd previously encountered me by coincidence. He'd wait outside the Target where I shopped, sit in the coffee shop where I'd met my friend, and even park near the gas station where I usually filled up my car. When I changed my routine and started shopping at different stores, Kevin somehow figured out my new patterns. He'd appear at a grocery store I'd only visited once, or show up at a restaurant where I was having dinner with friends. The most frightening discovery came when I found a GPS tracking device attached to my car. It was hidden under the rear bumper, held in place with strong magnets. The device was small and sophisticated, the kind used by private investigators or suspicious spouses. With this evidence, I was able to get a restraining order against Kevin. The police arrested him for stalking and invasion of privacy. During the investigation, they discovered that Kevin had been using multiple fake accounts to book rides with me and had been tracking my movements for months. Kevin's obsession went far beyond normal passenger interest. He'd been using rideshare trips as opportunities to study my habits, learn my routes, and gather information about my personal life. He'd kept detailed notes about our conversations and had been systematically following me to map out my daily routines. During questioning, Kevin admitted to following me, but claimed he was just trying to ensure my safety as a female driver working alone at night. He insisted that his behavior was protective rather than predatory, and that he'd developed feelings for me during our rides together. Kevin was sentenced to 8 months in jail and 18 months of probation. He's also banned from using rideshare services and required to stay away from me and my residence. The restraining order prohibits him from coming within 1,000 feet of me. The experience completely changed how I approach rideshare driving. I no longer engage in personal conversations with passengers, even ones who seem friendly and harmless. I keep interactions focused strictly on the ride itself, and I trust my instincts when someone seems too interested in my personal life. Uber also implemented new safety features for drivers, including an emergency button that connects directly to 911, and better screening processes for passengers who create multiple accounts. They also provide resources for drivers who experience harassment or stalking. The hardest part was realizing how Kevin had manipulated our professional relationship. He'd been the perfect passenger, polite, punctual, good tipper, but it was all a performance designed to gain my trust and access to my life. He turned my job into a tool for his obsession. I eventually returned to rideshare driving, but I'm much more cautious about boundaries now. I use a different car, work different hours, and never pick up passengers from the same location repeatedly. I've also installed additional security measures and always let someone know my planned route and expected return time. Kevin is scheduled for release in 3 months, and I'm already making plans to relocate to a different city. The thought of him being free and potentially resuming his surveillance is terrifying. I know he still has my personal information and could easily find me again if he wanted to. The experience taught me that predators can hide behind any legitimate interaction. Kevin used his role as a passenger to justify his invasive behavior, claiming it was all about ensuring my safety. But what he was really doing was using my professional service as an excuse to stalk and monitor my entire life. I now tell other rideshare drivers to be wary of passengers who ask too many personal questions or who seem more interested in the driver's life than getting to their destination. Those red flags that seem like friendly conversation can actually be signs of something much more dangerous. The scariest part wasn't the tracking device or the following. It was realizing that Kevin had been planning this obsession from our very first ride. He'd chosen me as a target and then systematically used our professional relationship to gather intelligence about my life, all while maintaining the facade of being a model customer. My name is Sarah, and I'm a 23-year-old graduate student at Northwestern University who makes extra money tutoring high school students online. I specialize in AP Chemistry and Biology, and I've been working through an online platform called Study Connect for about 10 months. The flexibility is perfect for my schedule, and I genuinely enjoy helping students understand complex scientific concepts. What I didn't anticipate was that one student's father would become so invested in my teaching methods that he'd turn our professional relationship into his personal obsession. It started with a student I'll call Emma, a junior at a private high school in Naperville who was struggling with AP chemistry. Her father, who I'll call Richard Brennan, had signed her up for twice weekly sessions to help improve her grades before college applications. Richard was very involved in Emma's education, which I initially saw as a positive sign of parental support. During our first video call, Richard insisted on being present to understand the tutoring process. This wasn't unusual. Many parents like to observe initial sessions to ensure their money is well spent. Richard sat just off camera, but would occasionally lean in to ask questions about my teaching approach or to clarify concepts I was explaining to Emma. Sarah has such a clear way of explaining things, he'd tell Emma. Make sure you're taking good notes on her methods. Richard seemed genuinely impressed with my teaching style and asked detailed questions about my educational background. I explained that I was working on my master's in chemistry at Northwestern and planned to pursue a PhD. He was particularly interested in my research focus and asked about my long-term career goals. After a few sessions, Richard started joining the calls more regularly, even when Emma seemed comfortable with the material. He'd position himself where I could see him on camera and would take his own notes during our sessions. He claimed he wanted to help Emma review the concepts between our meetings. I'm not great at chemistry myself, he'd explain, but if I understand your teaching methods, I can reinforce them when Emma and I study together. At first, I thought this level of parental involvement was admirable, if a bit intense. Richard was clearly invested in Emma's success and wanted to support her learning in every way possible. He always spoke respectfully about education and seemed to value my expertise. But then, Richard started requesting additional communication outside of our scheduled sessions. He began sending me emails with questions that went far beyond Emma's coursework. He'd ask about my research projects, my opinions on different chemistry textbooks, and my thoughts on various teaching methodologies. The emails were always professional in tone, but they were becoming frequent and increasingly personal. I've been reading about your research area, he'd write. I find your approach to chemical education fascinating. Have you considered publishing your tutoring methods? I think you have insights that could benefit many students. Richard also started asking about my schedule and availability. He wanted to know if I tutored other students, what my typical day looked like as a graduate student, and whether I ever did in-person tutoring. He claimed he was considering additional sessions for Emma and wanted to understand my full availability. When I mentioned during one session that I was presenting my research at a conference in Chicago, Richard immediately wanted to know all the details. Which conference was it? What was my presentation topic? Would it be open to the public? He said he was interested in attending to learn more about current chemistry education research. I gave him the basic information, thinking it was just academic curiosity. The conference was at a downtown hotel, and my presentation was scheduled for a Saturday morning in the education track. Richard seemed very excited about the opportunity to see me present my work. The day of the conference, I was setting up my poster presentation when I noticed Richard in the audience. He'd actually attended the conference and was sitting in the front row, taking detailed notes during my talk. Afterward, he approached me with specific questions about my research and complimented my presentation skills. "You're even more impressive in person," he said. "Emma is so lucky to have you as a tutor. I can see why she's improving so much." Richard suggested we grab coffee to discuss Emma's progress, and I agreed, thinking it would be a good opportunity to talk about her academic goals. But during our conversation, Richard spent more time asking about my personal life than discussing his daughter's chemistry grades. He wanted to know about my living situation as a graduate student, whether I enjoyed Chicago, what I did for fun outside of research and tutoring. He also asked about my family, my undergraduate experience, and my plans after graduation. "You must work incredibly hard," he said. "Do you ever take breaks? What do you do to relax and unwind?" I kept trying to steer the conversation back to Emma's tutoring, but Richard seemed more interested in learning about me personally. He mentioned that he traveled to Chicago frequently for work, and suggested we meet for coffee again to discuss educational strategies. After the conference, Richard's emails became more frequent and personal. He'd send articles about chemistry education with notes like, "This made me think of you," or "I'd love to hear your thoughts on this approach." He also started commenting on details from our video sessions that had nothing to do with the tutoring content. "I noticed you have a new plant in your background," he'd write. "Are you interested in botany as well as chemistry? I'd love to hear about your other hobbies and interests." The most concerning development was when Richard started requesting one-on-one video calls without Emma present. He claimed he wanted to discuss her progress privately and plan more advanced lessons. During these calls, Richard would ask increasingly personal questions while barely mentioning his daughter. "Tell me about your typical day," he'd say. "I'm fascinated by the life of a graduate student. Do you live alone? Do you feel safe in your neighborhood? Chicago can be dangerous for young women." Richard also began making comments that suggested he was paying very close attention to my appearance and behavior during our video calls. He'd notice if I was wearing different jewelry, if I'd changed my hair, or if I seemed tired or stressed. "You look like you've been working hard lately," he'd observe. "Are you taking care of yourself? You're too valuable to burn out." When I tried to maintain professional boundaries and redirect conversations back to Emma's tutoring, Richard would become subtly pushy. He'd insist that understanding my personal approach to learning was essential for supporting his daughter's education. The situation escalated when Richard started showing up at Northwestern's campus. I was leaving the chemistry building after a late lab session when I saw Richard waiting by the entrance. He acted surprised to see me and explained that he'd been in the area for a business meeting and thought he'd stop by to see the campus where his favorite tutor studied. "I hope you don't mind," he said. "I was curious about your research environment. Would you mind showing me around the chemistry department? I promise I won't take much of your time." I felt uncomfortable but didn't want to seem rude to a client's parent. I gave him a brief tour of the public areas, but Richard asked detailed questions about my specific lab, my research schedule, and which professors I worked with. A week later, Richard appeared at a coffee shop near campus where I often studied. He claimed he'd been meeting a colleague nearby and recognized me through the window. He asked if he could join me and spend an hour asking about my research while barely mentioning Emma. The third campus encounter was what convinced me that Richard was deliberately seeking me out. I was at the university library on a Sunday evening when Richard approached my study table. This time, his excuse was that he'd been visiting the campus bookstore and decided to explore the library. "I love academic environments," he said. "There's something inspiring about being surrounded by all this knowledge. Do you study here often? It seems like the perfect place for someone as dedicated as you." I realized that Richard had been learning my routines and deliberately timing his visits to coincidentally encounter me. The campus was large, and the chances of randomly running into the same person 3 times in different locations were virtually impossible. I decided to address the situation directly during our next tutoring session. I told Richard that while I appreciated his interest in Emma's education, I needed to maintain professional boundaries and focus our interactions on her academic needs. Richard's response was immediate and concerning. His friendly demeanor shifted, and he became defensive and argumentative. "I'm just trying to be a supportive parent," he said. "Emma's education is my top priority, and understanding your methods helps me help her. I don't understand why you're being so unfriendly all of a sudden." He accused me of being unprofessional and suggested that I was being paranoid about his intentions. He claimed that all his questions and campus visits were motivated purely by his desire to support Emma's learning. But then Richard made a comment that revealed the true nature of his interest. "I've invested a lot of time and money in this tutoring relationship. I think I deserve to understand exactly what I'm paying for, including getting to know the person who's influencing my daughter's education." The way he said invested and getting to know made it clear that Richard saw our professional relationship as something more personal. He wasn't just paying for tutoring services. He believed he was entitled to access to my personal life. I immediately contacted StudyConnect's support team and reported Richard's behavior. The platform has strict policies about appropriate client-tutor interactions, and they took my concerns seriously. They reviewed our session recordings and email communications and agreed that Richard had crossed professional boundaries. StudyConnect terminated Richard's account and refunded his remaining session credits. They also implemented additional monitoring for my future sessions and provided resources for tutors dealing with inappropriate client behavior. But Richard didn't accept the termination quietly. He started contacting me directly through email and social media, bypassing the platform's communication systems. His messages became increasingly aggressive and entitled. "You've ruined Emma's education over your own paranoia," he wrote. "I was just trying to be a good father, and you've turned it into something inappropriate. You owe it to Emma to continue her tutoring." Richard also began leaving negative reviews for my tutoring services on multiple platforms, claiming I was unprofessional and had abandoned his daughter without cause. He created several fake accounts to post these reviews, trying to damage my reputation as a tutor. The most frightening escalation came when Richard started showing up at my apartment building. I lived in graduate student housing near campus, and Richard would wait in the parking lot or lobby, claiming he just wanted to talk and resolve our misunderstanding. "I drove all the way here to apologize," he'd say when I refused to speak with him. "I think there's been a miscommunication about my intentions. Can't we just have a conversation like adults?" I contacted campus security and filed a police report. Officer Lisa Chen took my statement and explained that while Richard's behavior was clearly stalking, it would be challenging to prosecute without direct threats or evidence of criminal activity. She advised me to document every contact attempt, avoid being alone on campus when possible, and consider getting a restraining order if the harassment continued. She also coordinated with campus security to increase patrols around my building. The breakthrough came when I discovered that I wasn't Richard's first target. Officer Chen's investigation revealed that Richard had been reported by 2 other online tutors for similar behavior. He had a pattern of becoming obsessed with young female educators and using his role as a concerned parent to justify invasive behavior. One of the previous tutors had obtained a restraining order against Richard after he'd followed her to her workplace and attempted to contact her family members. The other had been forced to change her name on tutoring platforms and move to a different city to escape his harassment. With this evidence of a pattern, I was able to get a restraining order against Richard. He was arrested for violating the order when he showed up at my apartment building again, and during questioning, he admitted to tracking my schedule and deliberately seeking me out. Richard's obsession went beyond normal parental involvement in his daughter's education. He'd been using Emma's tutoring as an excuse to develop a relationship with me, gathering personal information and creating opportunities for contact outside of our professional interactions. During the investigation, police discovered that Richard had been taking screenshots of our video sessions and had created detailed files about my personal life based on information gathered during our conversations. He'd also been researching my academic background and had contacted my professors under false pretenses. Richard was sentenced to 6 months in jail and 2 years of probation. He's also banned from using online tutoring platforms and required to stay away from Northwestern's campus. The restraining order prohibits him from contacting me or coming within 500 feet of my residence. The experience completely changed how I approach online tutoring. I no longer allow parents to participate in sessions beyond initial introductions, and I keep all communications strictly focused on academic content. I also use a virtual background during video calls to avoid revealing personal information about my living space. Study Connect implemented new safety protocols for tutors, including better screening of clients and clearer guidelines about appropriate parent involvement. They also provide resources for tutors who experience harassment and have a dedicated support team for safety concerns. The hardest part was realizing how Richard had manipulated his role as a concerned parent to justify his invasive behavior. He'd use Emma's education as a cover for his obsession, claiming that everything he did was motivated by wanting to support his daughter's learning. I felt terrible for Emma, who lost a tutor. She was working well with because of her father's inappropriate behavior. She had no idea what Richard was doing and was genuinely confused when I stopped tutoring her. The situation wasn't her fault, but she suffered the consequences of her father's actions. Richard is scheduled for release in 4 months, and I'm already taking precautions. I've moved to a different apartment, changed my tutoring platform username, and I'm considering transferring to a different university for my PhD to ensure he can't find me again. The experience taught me that predators can hide behind any legitimate relationship, even the parent-tutor dynamic. Richard used his role as Emma's father to justify his invasive questions and behavior, claiming it was all about supporting his daughter's education. I now tell other online tutors to be wary of parents who seem more interested in the tutor's personal life than their child's academic progress. Those red flags that seem like engaged parenting can actually be signs of something much more dangerous. The scariest part was realizing that Richard had been planning this obsession from our very first session. He'd used Emma's genuine need for chemistry help as an opportunity to gain access to a young woman he could manipulate and control, all while maintaining the facade of being a devoted father. My name is Megan, and I'm a 24-year-old professional dog walker in Portland, Oregon. I started my pet care business called Pause and Play about 8 months ago, and it's been growing steadily through word of mouth and online reviews. I love working with animals, and the job gives me the freedom to be outdoors while building relationships with both pets and their owners. What I didn't expect was that one client would become so obsessed with monitoring my care of his dog that he'd turn my daily walks into his personal surveillance operation. It began with a client I'll call Doctor. Marcus Webb, a 38-year-old psychiatrist who owned a beautiful golden retriever named Bailey. Dr. Webb contacted me through my website in late February, explaining that his work schedule had become increasingly demanding, and he needed someone reliable to walk Bailey during the day. He seemed like the ideal client, professional, articulate, and clearly devoted to his dog's well-being. During our initial consultation at his house in the Pearl District, Dr. Webb was extremely thorough about Bailey's care requirements. He had detailed notes about the dog's walking schedule, preferred routes, dietary restrictions, and behavioral quirks. He explained that Bailey was anxious around other dogs and needed specific handling techniques to stay calm during walks. Bailey is very sensitive to routine changes, Dr. Webb explained. I found that consistency is key to managing his anxiety. I hope you'll be able to maintain the exact schedule and routes that work best for him. I appreciated Dr. Webb's attention to detail and his obvious concern for Bailey's well-being. Many pet owners are casual about their animal's care, so it was refreshing to work with someone who took it seriously. We agreed that I'd walk Bailey every weekday at 1 p.m. for exactly 45 minutes, following a specific route through the nearby park. Dr. Webb also mentioned that he had security cameras around his property and would occasionally check them remotely to ensure Bailey was being cared for properly. This seemed reasonable. Many clients have security systems, and responsible pet owners want to monitor their animals' care. The first few weeks went smoothly. Bailey was a sweet, well-trained dog who responded well to my handling. I followed Dr. Webb's instructions precisely, taking the same route at the same time each day. and sending him brief updates via text about how the walks went. But then Dr. Webb started requesting increasingly detailed reports about our activities. Instead of simple updates like, Bailey had a great walk today, he wanted minute-by-minute accounts of everything that happened. Which specific paths did we take through the park? How many other dogs did we encounter? What was Bailey's energy level at different points during the walk? I'm trying to track patterns in Bailey's behavior, Dr. Webb explained when I asked about the detailed reporting. As a psychiatrist, I understand how environmental factors can affect anxiety levels. Your observations help me optimize his care. Dr. Webb also began asking about my interactions with other people during our walks. Did I talk to other dog owners? What did we discuss? Did anyone ask questions about Bailey or seem particularly interested in him? Bailey is a valuable purebred, he said. I worry about dog theft in the city. I need to know if anyone is paying unusual attention to him. These requests seemed excessive, but Dr. Webb was paying well and was always polite about his requirements. I started taking more detailed notes during our walks to satisfy his need for information. Then Dr. Webb began showing up during our walks. The first time I was in Laurelhurst Park with Bailey, when I noticed Dr. Webb sitting on a bench about 50 yards away. He was reading a book and didn't acknowledge us, but I found it odd that he'd be in the park during his lunch break when he'd hired me specifically because he couldn't walk Bailey himself. When I mentioned seeing him, Dr. Webb explained that he'd had a cancellation and decided to grab lunch in the park. He said he'd seen us, but didn't want to interrupt Bailey's routine by coming over to say hello. I was actually pleased to observe your technique from a distance, he said. You handle Bailey exactly the way I hoped you would. The second sighting was at a different location along our usual route. Dr. Webb was in his car at a parking meter, apparently making phone calls. Again, he didn't approach us, but I could see him watching as we passed. By the fourth time I spotted Dr. Webb during our walks, I realized he was deliberately following us. He'd positioned himself at different points along our route, always with a plausible excuse for being there, but clearly monitoring our activities. When I confronted him about it, Dr. Webb became defensive, but tried to rationalize his behavior. I'm not following you, he insisted. I work in this area, and I have legitimate reasons for being in these locations. If I happen to see you and Bailey during my daily activities, that's just coincidence. But his explanations didn't add up. Dr. Webb's office was downtown, nowhere near the residential neighborhoods where we walked. There was no logical reason for him to be in Laurelhurst Park or the surrounding streets during the middle of the day, unless he was specifically tracking our movements. Dr. Webb also started asking increasingly personal questions about my life and schedule. Did I walk other dogs in the neighborhood? What time did I start and finish work each day? Did I live nearby, or did I drive to the area for Bailey's walks? I'm just trying to understand your business model, he said when I questioned his interest. I might recommend you to other pet owners, and they'll want to know about your availability and service area. But the questions felt invasive, especially combined with his habit of appearing during our walks. Dr. Webb seemed more interested in monitoring me than ensuring Bailey's care. The situation escalated when I discovered that doctor. Webb had been tracking my location through technology. I'd noticed that my phone battery was draining faster than usual, and my data usage had increased significantly. When I took it to a tech repair shop, they found spyware that had been installed remotely. The software was sophisticated and could track my location, monitor my calls and texts, and even access my camera and microphone. The technician explained that this type of spyware typically requires physical access to install, or it can be downloaded through malicious links sent via text or email. I immediately thought of Dr. Webb, who had sent me several links to articles about dog behavior and pet care apps. I reported the spyware to the police and filed a complaint against Dr. Webb. Detective James Rodriguez took my statement and explained that installing tracking software without consent was a serious crime that could result in felony charges. The investigation revealed the full extent of Dr. Webb's surveillance operation. He'd been using the spyware to track my movements throughout the day, not just during Bailey's walks. He knew where I lived, which other clients I visited, where I shopped, and even where I went on weekends. Dr. Webb had also been using his security cameras to monitor my interactions with Bailey in ways that went far beyond normal pet care oversight. He'd installed additional cameras along our walking route and had been recording our activities from multiple angles. Most disturbing was what police found when they searched Dr. Webb's home office. He had detailed files on my daily routines, maps of my movements around the city, and photographs taken during our walks that showed me rather than Bailey as the primary subject. Dr. Webb had also been researching my personal background, including my family members, my previous employment, and my social media activity. He'd created fake profiles to follow my accounts and had been monitoring my online activity for months. During questioning, Dr. Webb admitted to the surveillance, but claimed it was all motivated by concern for Bailey's well-being. He insisted that as a psychiatrist, he understood the importance of thorough monitoring and that he was just being a responsible pet owner. But the evidence showed that Dr. Webb's obsession went far beyond pet care. He'd been using Bailey's walks as an excuse to monitor and control my daily activities. The dog was just a pretext for gaining access to my life. The investigation also revealed that Bailey didn't actually have the anxiety issues Dr. Webb had described. A veterinary examination showed that the dog was perfectly healthy and well socialized. Dr. Webb had fabricated the behavioral problems to justify his excessive monitoring requirements. Dr. Webb was arrested and charged with stalking, invasion of privacy, and illegal surveillance. He was also reported to the state medical board for professional misconduct. During the legal proceedings, it came out that he'd been disciplined previously for inappropriate behavior toward female colleagues. Dr. Webb pleaded guilty to avoid a trial and was sentenced to 1 year in jail plus 2 years of probation. He's also required to undergo psychological evaluation and treatment, and he's prohibited from owning pets or hiring pet care services during his probation period. The experience completely changed how I approach my dog walking business. I no longer accept clients who seem overly controlling or who ask excessive questions about my personal life. I also implemented new safety protocols, including GPS tracking that my family can monitor and regular check-ins with trusted contacts. I've also become much more cautious about technology security. I regularly scan my devices for spyware. I'm careful about clicking links from clients. And I use a separate phone for business communications that I replace frequently. The hardest part was realizing how Dr. Webb had manipulated his role as a concerned pet owner to justify his invasive behavior. He'd used his professional credentials as a psychiatrist to lend credibility to his excessive monitoring requirements, claiming it was all based on scientific understanding of animal behavior. I felt terrible for Bailey, who was an innocent victim in his owner's obsession. The dog had been used as a tool for stalking and had no behavioral issues that required the intensive monitoring Dr. Webb had demanded. Bailey was eventually rehomed to a family member who could provide appropriate care. Dr. Webb is scheduled for release in 8 months, and I'm already taking precautions. I've moved to a different neighborhood, changed my business name and website, and I'm considering relocating to a different city entirely. The thought of him being free and potentially resuming his surveillance is terrifying. The experience taught me that predators can hide behind any legitimate service relationship. Dr. Webb used his role as a pet owner to justify his invasive monitoring, claiming it was all about responsible animal care. But what he was really doing was using my professional services as an excuse to stalk and control my daily life. I now tell other pet care providers to be wary of clients who seem more interested in the service provider's personal life than their animal's well-being. Those red flags that seem like conscientious pet ownership can actually be signs of something much more dangerous. The scariest part was realizing how Dr. Webb had been planning this surveillance from our very first meeting. He'd chosen me as a target and then systematically used Bailey's care as an excuse to monitor my every movement, all while maintaining the facade of being a devoted pet owner. The case also highlighted how professional credentials can be used to manipulate victims. Dr. Webb's background as a psychiatrist made his excessive monitoring seem more legitimate and scientific, when in reality it was just sophisticated stalking disguised as pet care. I still love working with animals, but I'm much more careful about boundaries now. I've learned that some people will exploit any service relationship if it gives them access to someone they want to control, even something as innocent as dog walking. My name is Ashley, and I'm a 27-year-old freelance photographer specializing in family portraits and event photography in San Diego. I've been building my business for about 2 years, and most of my clients come through referrals and social media. I love capturing special moments for families and helping people preserve their memories. What I didn't anticipate was that one client would become so fixated on being photographed that he'd turn our professional sessions into his personal documentation project of my life. It started with a client I'll call Nathan Pierce, a 41-year-old real estate agent who contacted me in early April about family photos. He explained that he was recently divorced and wanted updated portraits with his 2 young children for his new apartment and professional materials. Nathan seemed like a straightforward client. He had a clear vision for what he wanted and was willing to pay my full rate for a premium session. During our initial consultation at a coffee shop in La Jolla, Nathan was extremely detail-oriented about the photo shoot. He wanted to know everything about my process. What equipment I used, how I edited photos, what my typical timeline looked like from shoot to delivery. He also asked about my background and training, seeming genuinely interested in my artistic development. "I really value professional photography," Nathan said. "I can tell you take your craft seriously. I want to make sure we get this right because these photos are important to me and my kids." Nathan booked a 2-hour session at Balboa Park for the following weekend. He also mentioned that he might be interested in additional shoots in the future, perhaps some professional headshots for his real estate business, and maybe holiday photos with his children later in the year. The photo session went well initially. Nathan's kids, ages 6 and 8, were cooperative and seemed comfortable with me. Nathan was an engaged father who clearly loved his children, and I was able to capture some beautiful, candid moments of their interactions. But during the shoot, I noticed that Nathan was paying unusual attention to my photography techniques. Instead of focusing on posing with his children, he'd watch me work and ask detailed questions about my camera settings, lighting choices, and composition decisions. "That's such an interesting angle," he'd say when I'd crouch down for a low shot. "How did you know that would work? Can you show me exactly how you're holding the camera?" Nathan also started making comments about my appearance and demeanor while I worked. He'd mention how professional I looked, how gracefully I moved around the subjects, and how my personality put his children at ease. "You're a natural at this," he said. "I love watching you work. You should consider doing behind-the-scenes videos of your process. I bet other photographers would find it educational." After the session, Nathan was effusive in his praise and immediately booked a follow-up appointment for professional headshots. He also asked if I'd be interested in doing some practice sessions where he could learn photography techniques by observing my work with other subjects. "I've always been interested in photography as a hobby," he explained. "Would you consider letting me shadow you during other shoots? I'd pay for the privilege of learning from a professional." I declined the shadowing request, explaining that my clients expected privacy during their sessions, but Nathan seemed disappointed and continued to bring up the idea in subsequent communications. When we met for his headshot session the following week, Nathan's behavior became more concerning. He'd booked a 2-hour slot for what should have been a 30-minute shoot, claiming he wanted to try multiple outfits and locations. During the session, Nathan spent more time asking about my personal life than focusing on his photos. He wanted to know about my other clients, my typical schedule, and whether I ever did shoots at private residences. "Do you ever feel unsafe doing photography alone?" he asked. "I worry about young women working by themselves, especially when meeting new clients. Have you ever had any bad experiences?" Nathan also started making requests that seemed designed to prolong our time together. He'd ask for multiple outfit changes, request shots in different locations around the area, and insist on reviewing every photo on my camera's LCD screen immediately after taking it. "I want to make sure we're getting exactly what I need," he'd say. "Can you show me that last shot again? I think we should try a few more variations." What should have been a quick headshot session stretched to nearly 3 hours, because Nathan kept finding reasons to continue shooting. He also asked if we could grab coffee afterward to discuss the editing process and talk about future photography projects. After delivering Nathan's photos, I expected our professional relationship to be complete. But Nathan immediately started requesting additional services and sessions. He wanted updated photos for different seasons, shots of his apartment for real estate marketing, and even offered to pay me to photograph his children's sporting events and school activities. Each request came with detailed explanations about why the photos were urgently needed. Nathan also began asking about my availability for last-minute shoots, claiming he often had sudden needs for professional photos due to his real estate business. He'd text me at odd hours, asking if I was free for emergency sessions that always seemed to involve extended time together. The red flags became impossible to ignore when Nathan started showing up at locations where I was working with other clients. I was doing a family session at Sunset Cliffs when I noticed Nathan watching from a distance. He was sitting on a bench about 100 yards away, apparently reading a book, but I could see him glancing in our direction frequently. When I approached him after the session, Nathan acted surprised to see me and claimed he often came to that location to relax and enjoy the ocean view. He asked about the family I'd been photographing and seemed very interested in my client interactions. "You're so good with families," he said. "I love seeing you work with different people. Each session must be unique. Do you adapt your style based on the client's personalities?" The second incident was at a wedding venue in Del Mar, where I was doing engagement photos. Nathan appeared in the parking lot as I was loading my equipment, claiming he was there to show the property to potential real estate clients. "What a coincidence," he said. "I had no idea you'd be here today. How's the shoot going? This venue must provide beautiful backdrops for your work." Nathan lingered for nearly an hour, asking questions about wedding photography and expressing interest in potentially hiring me for future events. He also took photos of me working, claiming he wanted to document professional photographers in action for his social media. The third encounter was what convinced me that Nathan was deliberately tracking my schedule. I was at a private residence in Encinitas doing newborn photos when Nathan drove slowly past the house multiple times. When I confronted him via text, he claimed he was lost and looking for a client's property in the neighborhood. But Nathan had no legitimate reason to be in that area, and the timing was too coincidental. I realized he must have been monitoring my social media posts or somehow accessing my calendar to know where I'd be working. I started paying closer attention to Nathan's communications and discovered that he was asking increasingly specific questions about my schedule and client locations. He'd inquire about upcoming shoots, ask which neighborhoods I worked in most frequently, and even request recommendations for photography locations he claimed to need for his own business. The situation escalated when I found evidence that Nathan had been taking unauthorized photos of me during our sessions. While reviewing the photos from his headshot session, I noticed that Nathan's phone had been positioned to capture me working rather than focusing on his own poses. When I looked more carefully at the images he'd posted on social media, I saw several photos that showed me in the background, clearly taken without my knowledge or consent. Nathan had also been recording video during our sessions, claiming he wanted to document the professional photography experience for his personal records, but the videos focused more on my movements and techniques than on his own photos. Most disturbing was when I discovered that Nathan had been sharing photos and videos of me on photography forums and social media groups, presenting them as examples of professional photography in action. He'd posted detailed descriptions of my techniques and personal information about my business without my permission. I immediately contacted Nathan and demanded that he remove all unauthorized photos and videos of me from his social media accounts and stop recording during our sessions. His response was defensive and concerning. "I'm just documenting the photography process," he said. "You're a public figure running a business. People take photos in public all the time. I'm actually helping promote your work by showing how professional you are." Nathan refused to remove the content and claimed that he had the right to document his photography education experience. He also suggested that I was being unreasonable and that most photographers would appreciate the free promotion. When I threatened to involve law enforcement, Nathan's tone became more aggressive. He accused me of being unprofessional and suggested that I was trying to hide something by objecting to his documentation. "I've invested a lot of money in your services," he said. "I think I have the right to document what I'm paying for. If you're not comfortable being photographed while you work, maybe you're in the wrong business." I immediately stopped working with Nathan and blocked his contact information. But his harassment didn't end there. Nathan started leaving negative reviews for my business on multiple platforms, claiming I was unprofessional and had refused to provide services he'd paid for. He created fake accounts to post these reviews and included personal details about our sessions that violated client confidentiality. He also began contacting my other clients, claiming he was a fellow photographer who was concerned about my business practices. Nathan would reach out to people whose photos I'd posted on social media, suggesting that I might be using their images inappropriately. The most frightening escalation came when Nathan started appearing at my personal locations outside of work. I was at a grocery store near my apartment when Nathan approached me in the parking lot. He claimed he was shopping in the area and wanted to apologize for our misunderstanding. He insisted that his documentation had been innocent and that he just wanted to continue working together. "I think we got off on the wrong foot," he said. "I really value your work, and I'd hate for this to end our professional relationship. Can we talk about this over coffee?" When I refused and tried to leave, Nathan followed me to my car and continued trying to convince me to meet with him. He also took photos of my license plate and vehicle, claiming he needed the information for business records. I filed a police report the next day. Detective Maria Santos took my statement and explained that while Nathan's behavior was clearly harassment, it would be challenging to prosecute without direct threats or evidence of criminal activity. She advised me to document every contact attempt, avoid being alone in public when possible, and consider getting a restraining order if the harassment continued. She also suggested that I report Nathan's unauthorized use of my photos to social media platforms and consider consulting with an attorney about copyright violations. The breakthrough came when I discovered that Nathan had been using my photos and personal information to create fake photography profiles on dating apps and professional networking sites. He'd stolen photos of me from our sessions and social media to create profiles claiming to be a female photographer, looking for clients and collaborators. Nathan was using these fake profiles to contact other women in the photography industry, presumably to gather information or arrange meetings. With this evidence of identity theft and fraud, I was able to get a restraining order against Nathan. The police arrested him for stalking, harassment, and identity theft. During the investigation, they discovered that Nathan had been targeting multiple female photographers in the San Diego area using similar tactics. Nathan's obsession went far beyond normal client interest in photography. He'd been using our professional relationship as an excuse to document my personal and professional life, gathering information and images that he could use to create fake profiles and continue his harassment. During questioning, Nathan admitted to following me and taking unauthorized photos, but claimed it was all motivated by his genuine interest in learning photography. He insisted that his behavior was educational rather than predatory and that he'd never intended to cause harm. Nathan was sentenced to 10 months in jail and 18 months of probation. He's also banned from contacting me or any of his other victims, and required to stay away from photography events and locations where I work. The restraining order prohibits him from using my images or personal information in any capacity. The experience completely changed how I approach client relationships in my photography business. I no longer allow clients to record or photograph during sessions, and I include specific clauses in my contracts about unauthorized documentation. I also limit personal information sharing and keep interactions focused strictly on the photography services. I've also implemented new safety protocols, including sharing my schedule with trusted contacts, meeting new clients in public locations first, and using watermarked preview images to prevent unauthorized use of my work. The hardest part was realizing how Nathan had manipulated his role as a photography client to justify his invasive behavior. He'd used his interest in learning photography as a cover for his obsession, claiming that everything he did was educational and professional. Nathan is scheduled for release in 6 months, and I'm already taking precautions. I've changed my business name and website, moved to a different neighborhood, and I'm considering relocating to a different city entirely. The thought of him being free and potentially resuming his surveillance is terrifying. The experience taught me that predators can hide behind any legitimate business relationship. Nathan used his role as a client to justify his invasive documentation, claiming it was all about learning photography technique. But what he was really doing was using my professional services as an excuse to stalk and document my life. I now tell other photographers to be wary of clients who seem more interested in the photographer's process than their own photos, who ask excessive personal questions, or who want to document the sessions themselves. Those red flags that seem like genuine interest in photography can actually be signs of something much more dangerous. The scariest part was realizing that Nathan had been planning this obsession from our very first meeting. He'd chosen me as a target and then systematically used our professional relationship to gather images and information about my life, all while maintaining the facade of being an interested photography client. My name is Lily, and I'm a 25-year-old graduate student living alone in a one-bedroom apartment in Austin, Texas. I've been renting the same unit at Riverside Gardens for about 14 months, and it's been perfect for my needs. Affordable, close to campus, and generally well-maintained. What I didn't expect was that the building's maintenance supervisor would use routine repair requests as an excuse to systematically invade my privacy and turn my home into his personal obsession. It started with legitimate maintenance issues that any apartment complex would handle routinely. My kitchen faucet had developed a persistent drip, and I submitted a standard work order through the building's online portal. The maintenance supervisor, who I'll call Gary Hoffman, responded quickly and scheduled a repair appointment for the following Tuesday morning. Gary appeared to be in his late 40s, with graying hair and a quiet demeanor. He was polite and professional during that first visit, fixing the faucet efficiently and explaining what had caused the problem. He also mentioned that he'd been working at the complex for over 6 years and took pride in keeping the units in excellent condition. "I like to make sure all our residents are comfortable," Gary said as he packed up his tools. "Don't hesitate to submit requests if you notice any other issues. I'd rather fix small problems before they become big ones." I appreciated his thoroughness and attention to detail. Gary seemed like the kind of maintenance person every tenant hopes for. Knowledgeable, reliable, and genuinely concerned about the property's upkeep. But then, Gary started finding reasons to return to my apartment. A week after fixing the faucet, Gary knocked on my door claiming he needed to follow up on the repair to make sure it was still working properly. He spent nearly 20 minutes checking the faucet and examining other plumbing fixtures, asking detailed questions about my water usage patterns and whether I'd noticed any other issues. "Sometimes these older fixtures can develop new problems after we work on them," he explained. "I want to make sure everything is functioning perfectly for you." Gary also began pointing out potential maintenance issues that I hadn't noticed or reported. He'd mentioned that my bathroom exhaust fan seemed louder than usual, or that the weather stripping around my windows might need replacement, or that my air conditioning unit could benefit from additional servicing. "I've been doing this for years," he'd say. "I can spot problems before they become serious. Would you like me to take care of these things for you?" At first, I thought Gary was just being proactive about building maintenance, but his visits became increasingly frequent and seemed to involve more inspection than actual repair work. Gary would spend extended periods in my apartment, examining fixtures and systems that weren't related to any reported problems. He'd check outlets, test light switches, inspect closets for potential electrical issues, and even examine my personal belongings under the guise of looking for maintenance concerns. "I noticed you have a lot of electronics," he'd observe while looking at my computer setup. "We need to make sure the electrical system in this unit can handle the load. Have you experienced any power fluctuations?" Gary also started asking personal questions about my lifestyle and schedule. He wanted to know when I was typically home, whether I traveled frequently, and if I had roommates or frequent visitors. He claimed this information helped him schedule maintenance work at convenient times. "I try to respect residents' privacy," he'd say. "If I know your schedule, I can plan repairs when you're not studying or sleeping. What are your typical class hours?" The red flags became impossible to ignore when Gary started showing up without prior notice or work orders. I'd come home from campus to find Gary in my apartment, claiming he was responding to an emergency maintenance request that I'd never submitted. He'd have elaborate explanations about urgent repairs that needed immediate attention, a potential gas leak, a water pressure issue, or an electrical problem that could be dangerous if left unaddressed. "I got a call from the office about a possible problem in your unit," he'd explain. "I wanted to check it out right away for your safety. I hope you don't mind that I let myself in." When I contacted the leasing office to verify these emergency requests, they had no record of any urgent maintenance issues in my apartment. The office manager, Sandra, seemed confused by my questions and assured me that all legitimate work orders would be documented in their system. Gary also began leaving evidence of his presence when I wasn't home. I'd return to find tools or equipment in my apartment that hadn't been there when I left, or I'd noticed that items had been moved or rearranged. When I asked Gary about this, he'd claim he'd been working on preventive maintenance while I was out. "I hope you don't mind that I moved a few things to access the electrical panel," he'd say. "I always try to put everything back exactly where I found it, but sometimes I miss small details." The most disturbing discovery was that Gary had been spending far more time in my apartment than any maintenance work would require. I started keeping track of when I submitted work orders and how long repairs actually took. A simple task like replacing a light fixture, which should take 15 minutes, would somehow require Gary to be in my apartment for over an hour. When I asked about the extended time, Gary would explain that he was being thorough and checking related systems to prevent future problems. He'd also mentioned that he enjoyed talking with residents and learning about their experiences living in the complex. "I take pride in my work," he'd say. "I'd rather spend extra time making sure everything is perfect than rush through a job and have problems later." But Gary's thoroughness seemed to focus more on examining my personal space than on actual maintenance tasks. He'd spend time looking through my belongings, checking my refrigerator for potential appliance issues, and even examining my bedroom for proper ventilation. The situation escalated when I realized that Gary had been accessing my apartment when I wasn't home, even without any maintenance requests. I started leaving small indicators, a piece of tape on my door, items positioned in specific ways, to detect unauthorized entry. Multiple times, I'd return home to find evidence that someone had been inside my apartment during my absence. When I confronted Gary about this, he initially denied entering without permission. But when I mentioned that I was considering installing security cameras, his story changed. "Sometimes I do quick safety checks when residents are out," he admitted. "It's part of my responsibility to ensure all units are secure and properly maintained. I always document these inspections in my personal records." Gary claimed that these unannounced visits were standard procedure and that all residents' leases included clauses allowing maintenance access for safety inspections. When I reviewed my lease agreement, I found no such provision. I immediately contacted the leasing office and filed a formal complaint about Gary's unauthorized access to my apartment. Sandra took my concerns seriously and promised to investigate the situation immediately. The investigation revealed the disturbing extent of Gary's inappropriate behavior. When Sandra reviewed the building's keycard access logs, she discovered that Gary had been entering my apartment multiple times per week, often staying for extended periods when I wasn't home. Gary had also been accessing other female residents' apartments without authorization, particularly targeting young women who lived alone. Several other tenants had complained about unauthorized entries and missing personal items, but their concerns had been dismissed as forgetfulness or misunderstandings. Most shocking was what Sandra found when she searched Gary's maintenance office. He had detailed files on multiple female residents, including copies of their lease applications, photos of their apartments, and personal items that had apparently been taken during unauthorized visits. Gary had been using his master key access to systematically invade residents' privacy, documenting their personal lives and stealing mementos from their homes. He'd created elaborate justifications for his behavior, claiming it was all related to building security and maintenance oversight. Sandra immediately fired Gary and changed all the locks in the building. She also contacted the police and filed reports on behalf of all the affected residents. The apartment complex hired a security company to conduct a thorough investigation of Gary's activities. The police investigation revealed that Gary's obsession with female residents went back several years. He'd been using his position as maintenance supervisor to gain access to women's apartments, where he'd install hidden cameras, steal personal items, and document intimate details of their lives. Gary had hidden cameras in multiple apartments, including mine, positioned to record residents' daily activities. He'd been collecting this footage for years, creating detailed profiles of women's routines, relationships, and personal habits. During the search of Gary's home, police found thousands of photos and videos of female residents, along with stolen personal items that served as trophies of his invasions. He'd also been selling some of the recorded footage online, turning his surveillance into a profitable criminal enterprise. Gary was arrested and charged with multiple felonies, including burglary, invasion of privacy, theft, and illegal surveillance. The investigation revealed that he'd victimized at least 12 women across 3 different apartment complexes where he'd worked over the past decade. During questioning, Gary admitted to the unauthorized entries, but claimed his behavior was motivated by genuine concern for residents' safety and well-being. He insisted that his surveillance was protective rather than predatory, and that he'd never intended to cause harm. Gary was sentenced to 4 years in prison and required to register as a sex offender. He's also banned from working in property management or any position that would give him access to people's homes. The apartment complex faced multiple lawsuits from affected residents and implemented comprehensive new security protocols. The experience completely changed how I think about apartment living and personal security. I now research property management companies thoroughly before signing leases, and I always ask about background check procedures for maintenance staff. I also installed my own security system and changed my locks immediately after moving into any new apartment. I've learned to document any maintenance visits and to trust my instincts when something feels wrong about service personnel's behavior. The hardest part was realizing how Gary had exploited his position of trust to violate my privacy in the most intimate way possible. He'd used his legitimate access to my home as a cover for systematic surveillance and theft, turning my safe space into his personal entertainment. I felt violated knowing that Gary had been watching me in my most private moments, documenting my daily routines, and stealing personal items as souvenirs of his invasions. The thought that he'd been selling footage of me online was particularly devastating. The case also revealed how property management companies often fail to properly screen and supervise maintenance staff. Gary had been able to abuse his position for years because there were no oversight mechanisms to detect unauthorized apartment access. I eventually moved to a different apartment complex with better security protocols and more transparent maintenance procedures. But the experience left me permanently cautious about who has access to my living space and how that access is monitored. Gary is scheduled for release in 2.5 years, and I'm already making plans to relocate to a different city before that happens. The thought of him being free and potentially resuming his predatory behavior is terrifying, especially since he knows so much about my personal life and habits. The experience taught me that predators can hide behind any position that provides legitimate access to victims. Gary used his role as a maintenance supervisor to justify his presence in women's homes, claiming it was all about building upkeep and resident safety. I now tell other young women to be extremely cautious about maintenance personnel who seem overly interested in their personal lives, who spend excessive time in their apartments, or who show up without proper documentation. Those red flags that seem like dedicated service can actually be signs of something much more dangerous. The scariest part was realizing that Gary had been planning and executing this surveillance operation for years, using his position to systematically target vulnerable women who trusted him to maintain their homes. He'd turned the basic need for apartment maintenance into an opportunity for exploitation and abuse. The case highlighted how important it is for property management companies to implement proper oversight of maintenance staff and to take residents' security concerns seriously. Too many women's complaints had been dismissed before the full extent of Gary's crimes was discovered. I still struggle with feeling safe in my own home, knowing that someone I trusted with access to my most private space had been violating that trust for months. The experience changed my relationship with my living space in ways that may never fully heal. My name is Emma, and I'm a 26-year-old social worker who volunteers at a local animal shelter called Second Chance Rescue in Denver, Colorado. I've been volunteering there for about 10 months, helping with dog walking, adoption events, and administrative tasks on weekends. I love working with animals and giving back to the community, and the shelter has become like a second home to me. What I didn't expect was that the volunteer coordinator would become so obsessed with my dedication to the cause that he'd turn my charitable work into his personal monitoring system. It started with what seemed like exceptional appreciation for my volunteer efforts. The coordinator, who I'll call David Chen, was a 39-year-old man who had been running the volunteer program at Second Chance Rescue for about 3 years. He was always enthusiastic about the work and seemed genuinely grateful for the time and energy that volunteers contributed to helping the animals. During my first few weeks at the shelter, Dave made a point of personally thanking me for my commitment and telling me how much the staff appreciated having reliable volunteers like me. He'd mentioned specific things I'd done well, how gently I handled nervous dogs, how efficiently I completed administrative tasks, or how well I connected with potential adopters during events. "You're exactly the kind of volunteer we need more of," David would say. "Your passion for animal welfare really shows in everything you do. The dogs respond so well to you." David also started assigning me to special projects and responsibilities that went beyond typical volunteer duties. He'd ask me to help train new volunteers, assist with social media posts about adoptable animals, and even help with fundraising events that required additional time commitments. "I know I can count on you," he'd explain when giving me these extra assignments. "You understand our mission better than most volunteers, and you have such a natural way with both animals and people." At first, I was flattered by David's confidence in my abilities, and happy to take on additional responsibilities. I genuinely cared about the shelter's mission and wanted to contribute as much as possible to helping animals find homes. But then David started requiring increasingly detailed reports about my volunteer activities. Instead of simply signing in and out like other volunteers, David asked me to keep detailed logs of everything I did during my shifts. He wanted to know which dogs I walked, how long each walk lasted, what behaviors I observed, and how the animals responded to my interactions. "We're trying to improve our volunteer program," David explained when I asked about the detailed reporting. "Your observations help us understand which approaches work best with different types of animals. You're so perceptive about animal behavior." David also began asking about my interactions with other volunteers and staff members. He wanted to know what conversations I'd had, whether anyone had mentioned concerns about shelter operations, and if I'd noticed any issues with how animals were being cared for. "As one of our most dedicated volunteers, you're in a unique position to observe things that staff might miss," he said. "I value your perspective on how we can improve our programs and better serve the animals." These requests seemed reasonable at first, but they gradually became more invasive and personal. David started asking about my life outside the shelter, my work schedule, my living situation, and whether I had pets of my own at home. "I'm always curious about what motivates our best volunteers," he'd say. "Understanding your background helps me better support your volunteer experience and maybe recruit similar people." David also began scheduling me for shifts that aligned with his own work schedule, claiming that he wanted to provide better supervision and support for volunteers, taking on additional responsibilities. "I like to be here when our most valuable volunteers are working," he explained. "That way I can answer questions immediately and make sure you have everything you need to be successful." The red flags became apparent when David started showing up at locations outside the shelter where I was present. The first incident was at a pet supply store where I was buying food for my own cat. David appeared in the same aisle and acted surprised to see me, explaining that he was shopping for supplies for the shelter and had recognized me from across the store. "What a coincidence," he said. "I was just thinking about you because we gotten some new dogs that I think you'd work really well with. Are you planning to volunteer this weekend?" David spent nearly 30 minutes following me around the store, asking about my cat and offering advice about pet care products. He also asked detailed questions about my apartment and whether I'd ever considered fostering animals from the shelter. The second encounter was at a coffee shop near my workplace, where I often grabbed lunch. David was sitting at a corner table with a laptop when I walked in, and he immediately waved me over to join him. "I love working from different locations sometimes," he said. "The shelter can get pretty hectic, so I come here when I need to focus on administrative tasks. Do you work around here?" When I mentioned that my office was nearby, David seemed very interested in learning more about my job and schedule. He asked what time I typically took lunch breaks, whether I worked late hours, and if I ever had flexibility to volunteer during weekday afternoons. The third meeting was what convinced me that these encounters weren't coincidental. I was at a veterinary clinic with my cat for a routine checkup when David walked into the waiting room. He claimed his personal dog needed emergency care, but I noticed he didn't actually have an animal with him. "My dog is already back with the vet," he explained when I asked. "I'm just waiting to hear the results of some tests. How's your cat doing? I hope everything is okay." David sat next to me in the waiting room and continued asking personal questions about my pet ownership experience and my thoughts on animal health care. He also mentioned that he'd been thinking about recommending me for a paid position at the shelter if any openings became available. I started to feel uncomfortable about these repeated encounters, especially since David always seemed to have detailed knowledge about my schedule and activities. I began paying closer attention to his behavior during my volunteer shifts. David would position himself where he could observe my work with the animals, often taking photos that he claimed were for the shelter's social media accounts or volunteer appreciation materials. But I noticed that many of the photos focused more on me than on the animals I was helping. "You're so photogenic when you're working with the dogs," he'd say. "These pictures really capture the spirit of our volunteer program. Would you mind if I use some of them for our website and promotional materials?" David also started asking other volunteers and staff members about me, gathering information about my personal life and opinions under the guise of evaluating volunteer satisfaction and engagement. "Emma is one of our star volunteers," he'd tell people. "I'm trying to understand what makes her so committed, so we can improve our recruitment and retention. Has she mentioned anything about her experience here or her life outside volunteering?" The situation escalated when I discovered that David had been accessing my personal information through the shelter's volunteer database. I'd provided standard information when I first applied to volunteer: my address, phone number, emergency contacts, and employment details. This information was supposed to be confidential and used only for volunteer coordination purposes. But David had been using this information to research my background and monitor my activities outside the shelter. He looked up my workplace, my apartment complex, and even my social media profiles to gather additional details about my life. When I confronted David about the inappropriate encounters and his access to my personal information, his response was defensive and concerning. "I'm just trying to be a good volunteer coordinator," he insisted. "I care about all our volunteers' well-being, and I want to make sure you're having a positive experience. If I happen to see you around town, of course I'm going to say hello." David claimed that his interest in my personal life was purely professional and motivated by his desire to improve the volunteer program. He insisted that understanding volunteers' backgrounds and motivations was essential for effective program management. But his explanations didn't address the frequency of our encounters or his detailed knowledge of my schedule and activities. When I suggested that his behavior was inappropriate, David became more aggressive in his response. "I've invested a lot of time and energy in developing you as a volunteer," he said. "You've received special training and opportunities that other volunteers haven't had. I think I deserve to understand whether that investment is worthwhile." The way David talked about investing in me and deserving information about my life made it clear that he saw our volunteer relationship as something more than professional. He seemed to believe that his role as coordinator gave him some kind of ownership over my time and personal information. I immediately stopped volunteering at Second Chance Rescue and filed a complaint with the shelter's board of directors. The board president, Margaret Williams, took my concerns seriously and launched an investigation into David's conduct. The investigation revealed that David had been inappropriately monitoring and pursuing multiple female volunteers over the past 2 years. He'd been using his position to access personal information, track volunteers' activities outside the shelter, and create societal inappropriate relationships under the guise of program management. Several other women came forward with similar experiences after my complaint became known. David had been following volunteers to their workplaces, showing up at their homes uninvited, and using shelter resources to research their personal lives. Most disturbing was the discovery that David had been taking and collecting photos of female volunteers without their knowledge or consent. He'd hidden cameras in volunteer areas and had been documenting women's activities for his personal collection. David had also been sharing volunteers' personal information with unauthorized individuals and had been using the shelter's database to conduct background checks and gather intelligence about women he was interested in pursuing. The board immediately fired David and reported his conduct to law enforcement. They also implemented new policies for volunteer coordination and personal information security to prevent similar abuses in the future. David was arrested and charged with stalking, invasion of privacy, and misuse of confidential information. During the investigation, police discovered that he'd been using his position at the shelter to target vulnerable women who were passionate about animal welfare. David's pattern was to identify dedicated female volunteers, gradually increase their responsibilities and his interaction with them, and then use his access to their personal information to monitor and pursue them outside the shelter environment. During questioning, David admitted to following volunteers and accessing their personal information, but claimed his behavior was motivated by genuine concern for volunteer safety and program improvement. He insisted that his actions were within his authority as volunteer coordinator. David was sentenced to 18 months in prison and 2 years of probation. He's also banned from working with volunteer organizations and required to stay away from all his previous targets. The shelter faced scrutiny from regulatory agencies and had to implement comprehensive new safeguards. The experience completely changed how I approach volunteer work and charitable organizations. I now research the backgrounds of staff members and ask detailed questions about information security and volunteer protection policies before committing to any organization. I also learn to trust my instincts when someone in a position of authority seems overly interested in my personal life or begins crossing professional boundaries. The fact that David was working for a charitable cause made his behavior seem more legitimate initially. The hardest part was realizing that David had exploited my genuine passion for animal welfare to justify his invasive behavior. He'd used my dedication to helping animals as a way to manipulate me into accepting inappropriate attention and monitoring. I felt betrayed that someone in a position of trust at an organization I cared about had been using that trust to violate my privacy and safety. The experience tainted my relationship with volunteer work and made me more cautious about getting involved with charitable causes. David is scheduled for release in 8 months, and I've already taken precautions to protect myself. I've moved to a different neighborhood, changed my contact information, and I'm considering relocating to a different city entirely. The experience taught me that predators can hide behind any cause or organization, even ones dedicated to helping others. David used his role as volunteer coordinator to justify his invasive behavior, claiming it was all about improving programs and supporting volunteers. I now tell other volunteers to be wary of coordinators or staff members who seem overly interested in their personal lives, who request excessive personal information, or who begin showing up in their daily routines outside the organization. The scariest part was realizing that David had been systematically targeting women who were passionate about helping animals, using their compassion and dedication as vulnerabilities to exploit. He'd turned charitable work into a hunting ground for potential victims. The case also highlighted how nonprofit organizations often lack proper oversight and safeguards to protect volunteers from staff misconduct. Too many organizations assume that people working for charitable causes have good intentions, without implementing proper screening and monitoring procedures. I eventually found another animal shelter where I could volunteer safely, but it took months to rebuild my trust in charitable organizations and their staff. The experience changed my relationship with volunteer work in ways that may never fully heal.